This is how wars really begin. Before the first missile, before the first strike, there is always a moment, a sentence, a deadline, a line drawn so publicly that the world has no choice but to react. If you want to understand power, watch what happens next. Before we go deeper, take a second to subscribe. This channel exists to break down the forces shaping your future, clearly, directly, without noise. Hello and welcome. I'm Alex. For years, I've studied the intersection of economics and politics, and today, we break down what's shaping our world. On Sunday, Donald Trump didn't just issue a warning. He triggered a global countdown. Open the Strait of Hormuz, he said, or you'll be living in hell. Then he added something far more important than the words themselves, a deadline. Tuesday. 8 p.m. Eastern Time. That timestamp matters more than most people realize. Because in geopolitics, a deadline is not about time. It is about constraint. It compresses decision-making. It removes ambiguity. It forces every actor, allies, adversaries, markets, into a narrowing corridor where options disappear and consequences accelerate. This is not diplomacy as it used to be practiced. This is coercive power, deployed in real time, in public, at scale. In the Cold War, ultimatums were delivered behind closed doors, filtered through diplomats, softened by ambiguity. Today, a single post can reach millions instantly, moving oil markets, shifting military postures, and forcing governments to respond before they have time to calculate. That is the structural shift we are living through. Trump understands this environment better than most. His approach is not built on quiet negotiation, it is built on pressure, speed, and psychological dominance. By setting a public deadline, he is not just speaking to Iran. He is locking himself into a position where backing down becomes politically and strategically costly. And that is where the real risk begins. Because when a leader draws a line this clearly, the system around him begins to harden. Advisors become constrained. Opponents become defiant. Markets begin pricing in outcomes that have not yet happened. This is how escalation becomes self-reinforcing. For the American public, this is not just another foreign policy headline. This is a moment where political messaging intersects directly with economic reality. Every hour that deadline approaches, energy markets react. Every signal from Washington or Tehran sends ripples through prices, through supply chains, through household costs. This is what power looks like in the modern world. Not just tanks and planes, but timelines, expectations, and the ability to shape behavior across systems. The question now is not whether Iran heard the message. The question is whether the system can absorb what comes next if they refuse. Because once the clock starts, it doesn't just measure time. It measures consequences. Hormuz, the most important waterway on Earth. If you want to understand who holds power in this crisis, don't look at speeches. Don't look at missiles. Look at a narrow strip of water between Iran and Oman. That's where the real leverage is. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a geographic feature. It is the central artery of the global energy system. Before this conflict, roughly 1 out of every 5 barrels of oil consumed on Earth moved through that corridor. Nearly a quarter of the world's liquefied natural gas followed the same path. That is not a trade route. That is infrastructure for civilization itself. And right now, that infrastructure is under pressure. When people hear about supply disruptions, they often imagine gradual shifts, slower shipments, higher costs, manageable adjustments. That is not how choke points work. Choke points don't bend. They break. When Hormuz tightens, the system doesn't recalibrate smoothly. It seizes. Tankers stop. Insurance rates spike. Shipping routes reroute inefficiently. And within days, not months, the effects begin to cascade through global markets. This is why energy economists don't treat Hormuz as just another variable. They treat it as a systemic risk trigger. Because the global economy is not built on abundance. It is built on flow. Factories don't run on oil reserves sitting underground. They run on oil arriving on time. Supply chains don't collapse because resources disappear. They collapse because timing breaks. Hormuz is where timing is enforced. And Iran understands that with absolute clarity. Geography has given Tehran something no military budget could ever buy: control over a bottleneck that the entire world depends on. It doesn't need to dominate global production. It only needs to disrupt global movement. That distinction is everything. Historically, we've seen moments where energy became a weapon. The 1973 oil embargo reshaped Western economies. The Suez Crisis exposed the fragility of trade routes. But those events unfolded in a slower, less interconnected world. Today, the system is tighter. Faster. More fragile. A disruption in Hormuz doesn't just affect oil traders in London or shipping firms in Singapore. It moves directly into the balance sheets of American companies and the wallets of American families. Transportation costs rise. Manufacturing costs rise. Food prices follow. Inflation doesn't creep, it accelerates. And that's before you factor in financial markets. Because once uncertainty enters the system, capital reacts instantly. Traders price in worst-case scenarios. Volatility spikes. Investment decisions freeze. What begins as a regional disruption becomes a global economic signal. This is why the current standoff is not just about access to a waterway. It is about control over the pace of the global economy. Whoever influences Hormuz influences inflation, growth, and financial stability far beyond the Middle East. That is the structural reality underlying every headline, every threat, every negotiation. And it leads to a simple but uncomfortable truth. This is not a battlefield defined by borders. This is a pressure point built into the architecture of the modern world. And once pressure builds at that point, it doesn't stay contained. Iran's gambit: leverage, not desperation. If you strip away the rhetoric, the threats, and the headlines, what you are left with is a brutal, almost mechanical truth: the modern global economy runs through a handful of narrow corridors. And the most important of them all is the Strait of Hormuz. This is not just a piece of geography. It is a control point built into the architecture of globalization. Every day, before this conflict escalated, nearly 20% of the world's oil supply moved through that narrow stretch of water. That number alone should stop you. Think about what it means in structural terms. Not production. Not reserves. Movement. Flow. The lifeblood of the global economy compressed into a single vulnerable passage. Now add liquefied natural gas, nearly a quarter of global LNG shipments. Add refined fuels. Add petrochemical inputs that feed directly into plastics, fertilizers, pharmaceuticals. Suddenly, Hormuz is not just about energy. It is about everything that energy enables. And that is where most people misunderstand the risk. They assume this is a supply problem. It's not. It's a timing problem. In economic theory, supply disruptions can be offset over time. Markets adjust. Producers increase output. Inventories are drawn down. But choke points don't operate on long timelines. They operate on immediacy. When flow is disrupted, the system doesn't gradually adapt. It jolts. Tankers don't arrive. Refineries don't receive feedstock. Contracts can't be fulfilled. And because modern supply chains are built on just-in-time delivery, there is no buffer large enough to absorb that kind of shock cleanly. This is where the financial system enters the picture. Because markets don't wait for shortages to appear. They price expectations. The moment Hormuz becomes unstable, traders begin to calculate worst-case scenarios. Oil prices spike not because supply has disappeared, but because the probability of disruption has increased. That distinction is critical. What we are seeing is not just a reaction to current conditions. It is a reaction to potential future constraints. And that is why volatility becomes so extreme. The system is not anchored to reality. It is anchored to risk. Now step back and look at the strategic dimension. Iran does not need to dominate global energy production to exert influence. It only needs to control the vulnerability in the system. This is a classic application of asymmetric power. When you cannot match your opponent in scale, you exploit structure. Geography becomes leverage. The Strait of Hormuz is narrow, confined, and difficult to secure completely. It is surrounded by terrain that allows for surveillance, for rapid response, for disruption. Small-scale actions, harassment of shipping, targeted strikes, even the threat of mines, can have outsized effects on perception and behavior. And in markets, perception is often more powerful than reality. Shipping companies reroute not when ships are sunk, but when the risk of being sunk rises. Insurers increase premiums based on probability, not certainty. Capital flows adjust accordingly. Within days, what was once a stable corridor becomes a contested zone, not necessarily because it is physically closed, but because it is financially and psychologically unstable. This is how control is exercised in the modern era. Not through total domination, but through selective disruption. Historically, we have seen versions of this dynamic. The Suez Canal crisis in 1956 exposed how dependent global trade was on narrow passages. The oil shocks of the 1970s demonstrated how energy could be weaponized to reshape economic policy across entire nations. But today's system is more tightly coupled than anything that came before. Globalization has increased efficiency, but at the cost of resilience. We built a system that assumes uninterrupted flow. We optimized for speed, for cost, for integration. And in doing so, we created points of failure that are disproportionately powerful. Hormuz is the most critical of those points. Now connect this back to the United States. When oil prices move, they don't stay in the commodity markets. They move through transportation costs, through manufacturing inputs, through logistics networks. They feed directly into inflation. And inflation, in turn, constrains monetary policy. The Federal Reserve cannot ignore sustained energy shocks. Interest rate expectations shift. Bond yields respond. Equity markets reprice risk. This is not a regional issue. This is a system-wide transmission mechanism. A disruption in Hormuz can tighten financial conditions in the United States without a single policy decision being made in Washington. It can act as an external shock that reshapes the economic landscape domestically. And that is where the financial motive becomes clear. Control over Hormuz is not just about political leverage. It is about influencing the cost structure of the global economy. It is about shifting the balance between growth and inflation. It is about forcing decision-makers, from central bankers to corporate executives, into reactive positions. In game theory terms, this is about altering the payoff matrix. If Iran can credibly threaten disruption, it changes the incentives for every other actor. It raises the cost of escalation. It increases the value of negotiation. It forces the United States and its allies to consider not just military outcomes, but economic consequences. And those consequences are not abstract. They show up in gas prices. They show up in grocery bills. They show up in the cost of doing business across the country. This is why the Strait of Hormuz matters more than any speech, more than any single military move. It is the point where geopolitics meets daily life. And right now, that point is under pressure. The deeper risk is not just that Hormuz remains contested. The deeper risk is that the system begins to adapt to that instability. Once markets internalize volatility, once supply chains begin to reroute permanently, once trust in uninterrupted flow is broken, the effects linger long after the immediate crisis ends. That is how temporary disruptions become structural shifts. And that is why this moment matters. Because what is being contested here is not just a waterway. It is control over the tempo of the global economy itself. America's response, power, risk, and calculation. What matters now is not what the United States says, it's how it chooses to act when the cost of action becomes real. And in this case, the cost was immediate, visible, and deliberate. After successfully extracting 2 downed airmen from inside Iran, U.S. forces faced a moment that defines modern strategic thinking. Their aircraft, highly specialized platforms designed for covert insertion and extraction, were no longer recoverable. The terrain, the timing, and the advancing Iranian presence turned those assets into liabilities. So they made the call. They destroyed them. Not damaged. Not abandoned. Eliminated. That decision cut straight to the core of how American power is structured in the 21st century. Because what you're seeing is not a battlefield improvisation. It is a pre-built doctrine, one that prioritizes long-term strategic dominance over short-term material preservation. The aircraft itself, even at a cost exceeding $100 million, is not the asset. The asset is what the aircraft carries. Embedded systems. Secure communications. Navigation architecture. Electronic warfare signatures. Mission software. These are not just tools, they are the invisible infrastructure of American military advantage. If those systems are captured, studied, and replicated, the damage is not financial. It is systemic. That is why destruction becomes protection. And that is a concept most people outside of strategic circles rarely confront. Power is not measured by what you keep. It is measured by what you are willing to lose to prevent your adversary from gaining ground. This is the same logic that governed the operation against Osama bin Laden. When a stealth helicopter went down, it was destroyed immediately. Not because it was expendable, but because it was too valuable to fall into the wrong hands. That same principle is now being applied under far more dangerous conditions. Because this time, it's not a one-off operation in a controlled environment. This is unfolding in the middle of an active, escalating conflict, inside a region where every action is being monitored, interpreted, and responded to in real time. And that introduces a second layer of meaning. The United States is not just protecting its technology. It is demonstrating operational reach under pressure. It is showing that it can enter contested territory, execute complex missions, and exit, even when conditions deteriorate. That is not just capability. That is signaling. To Iran, the message is unmistakable: the United States retains the ability to act decisively, even inside your strategic depth. To allies, the message is reassurance that American power projection is still intact. To markets, it is a reminder that escalation is not theoretical. It is operational. But here is where the calculation becomes dangerous. Because every demonstration of capability reduces uncertainty and increases tension. When one side proves it can act, the other side is forced to adjust. It recalculates its defenses, its thresholds, its willingness to respond. And that is how escalation loops form. Not through intention, but through interaction. This is the structural risk that sits beneath the surface. The United States is acting rationally within its doctrine. But rational actions, when layered across opposing systems, do not always produce stable outcomes. They produce friction. And friction, in high-speed environments like this, compresses time. Decisions are made faster. Reactions are sharper. The space for de-escalation narrows. That is the paradox at the heart of American power right now. It is strong enough to act anywhere. But that very strength is what makes containment harder once action begins. The question is no longer whether the United States can control the battlefield. The question is whether it can control the chain reaction that follows. The market reacts: fear, volatility, and the cost of war. What the market is telling you right now is simple, and deeply uncomfortable. It doesn't believe anyone is in control. When Donald Trump issues a deadline on the Strait of Hormuz and, in the same breath, suggests a deal might be imminent, the result is not clarity. It's fragmentation. Investors are forced to process two completely opposing realities at once. War or peace? Shock or relief? Spike or collapse? That is not a normal market condition. That is what we call a binary system under stress. You can see it in the numbers, but more importantly, you can feel it in the behavior. Oil surges past $110, then pulls back, then surges again. Not because supply has fundamentally changed in the last few hours, but because expectations are being rewritten in real time. This is no longer a fundamentals-driven market. This is a headline-driven system. And that distinction matters, because it changes how risk moves. In a fundamentals-driven market, prices adjust based on data, production levels, inventories, demand forecasts. In a headline-driven market, prices adjust based on perception, statements, threats, signals. That means volatility becomes faster, sharper, and more unpredictable. And volatility is not just noise. It is cost. For American households, that cost is immediate. Gas prices rise. Diesel follows. Transportation costs increase, and those increases ripple outward, into food prices, into consumer goods, into every corner of daily life. What begins as a geopolitical standoff becomes an economic burden that shows up in weekly budgets. This is what I call the invisible transmission mechanism. There is no vote. No legislation. No announcement. Just higher prices. And behind that, a deeper structural shift is taking place. Energy shocks don't stay contained within energy markets. They move into inflation expectations. And once inflation expectations rise, the financial system adjusts. Bond yields climb. Credit conditions tighten. The Federal Reserve is forced into a more constrained position, even if it hasn't changed policy yet. That is how geopolitics overrides monetary policy. And right now, that process is already underway. Markets are beginning to price in not just higher energy costs, but the possibility of sustained disruption. That is where the concept of stagflation enters the picture, the combination of rising prices and slowing growth. It is one of the most difficult environments for policymakers to manage, because the tools that fight inflation can weaken growth, and the tools that support growth can fuel inflation. There is no easy exit. At the same time, equity markets are sending a conflicting signal. Stocks rise on hopes of a deal, then stall as uncertainty returns. Investors are trying to hedge both outcomes simultaneously, positioning for resolution while protecting against escalation. That is not confidence. That is survival behavior. And it tells you something critical about the current moment. The system is not anchored. It is floating between narratives, reacting to each new signal without a stable baseline. That is why swings are so sharp. That is why confidence is so fragile. Because when markets lose their anchor, they don't drift. They snap. The real risk here is not just higher oil prices or temporary volatility. The real risk is that this environment becomes normalized, that markets adapt to a world where policy is unpredictable, where geopolitical shocks are frequent, and where stability is no longer assumed. Because once that shift happens, the cost of capital rises, investment slows, and growth becomes harder to sustain. And that is when a geopolitical crisis turns into an economic one. Not overnight. But steadily, structurally, and with consequences that last long after the headlines fade. The legal and moral edge, are we crossing a line? There is a threshold in every conflict that is harder to measure than troop movements or missile ranges. It's the moment when power begins to outrun restraint. And that is exactly where this situation is heading. When Donald Trump threatens to target bridges and power plants, the issue is no longer purely strategic. It becomes legal. It becomes moral. And more importantly, it becomes systemic, because once certain lines are crossed, they are very difficult to redraw. Under the framework of the Geneva Conventions, the distinction is clear in theory: military targets are legitimate, civilian infrastructure is protected unless it directly contributes to military operations. That distinction is not just legal language. It is one of the last structural guardrails preventing modern warfare from collapsing into total war. And yet, in practice, that line is increasingly blurred. Infrastructure today is dual use. Power plants can support military systems. Bridges can facilitate troop movement. The legal argument can be stretched, interpreted, justified. But that doesn't eliminate the underlying reality: these are systems that sustain civilian life. Electricity is not just energy. It is hospitals, water treatment, communications, daily survival. When you threaten those systems, you are not just targeting capacity. You are targeting continuity of life. This is where the risk expands beyond legality into legitimacy. Because the United States does not operate in a vacuum. Its power is not only derived from military capability or economic scale. It is also derived from its position as a rule setter, a country that has historically framed itself as a defender of international norms. Once actions begin to contradict that identity, the consequences ripple outward. Allies begin to question alignment. Neutral actors become more cautious. Adversaries gain narrative ground. Not because they are stronger, but because the moral framing of the conflict shifts. This is not abstract. It directly affects coalition building, diplomatic leverage, and long-term strategic positioning. Power, in the modern world, is not just about force. It is about perception of legitimacy. And legitimacy, once weakened, is extremely difficult to restore. Inside the United States, that tension is already visible. Chuck Schumer and others have warned that rhetoric crossing into threats against civilian infrastructure risks not only legal consequences, but strategic isolation. This is not simply political opposition. It reflects a deeper institutional concern about how far the system is willing to go. Because there is a second-order effect that often gets overlooked. When norms erode at the top level, they cascade. If the United States signals that civilian infrastructure is a valid target under pressure, it lowers the threshold globally. Other actors, state and non-state, adjust their own rules of engagement accordingly. What was once considered escalation becomes normalized. That is how the boundaries of acceptable conflict expand. Not through a single decision, but through precedent. And once that precedent is set, it doesn't stay contained within one conflict. It becomes part of the operating environment for future wars. This is the structural danger. Not just what happens in Iran, but what that decision teaches the world about what is now permissible. The United States is not just managing a crisis. It is defining a standard. And the question is no longer whether it can enforce its will. The question is whether it can do so without reshaping the very rules that have, for decades, supported its position at the top of the global order. The system under stress, a global margin call moment. What we are witnessing right now is not a series of isolated events. It is a system under pressure, and that pressure is building across every layer at the same time. Military, energy, financial, political. All of it is tightening. In finance, there is a concept that explains moments like this better than any geopolitical theory ever could. It's called a margin call. A margin call doesn't happen when things are stable. It happens when leverage builds quietly over time, when risks accumulate, when positions stretch, when the system assumes that tomorrow will look like today. And then something breaks. Not necessarily a collapse. Not immediately. But a trigger. A shock that forces every participant to reassess, to reduce exposure, to react all at once. That's where we are now. For years, the global system has been operating on a set of assumptions: energy flows freely, trade routes remain open, major powers avoid direct confrontation, and markets can absorb shocks without structural damage. Those assumptions are now being tested, simultaneously. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer a guaranteed corridor. Military operations are no longer contained within predictable boundaries. Political signaling is no longer measured, it is immediate, public, and volatile. Financial markets are no longer anchored to fundamentals, they are reacting to uncertainty in real time. That is not a normal environment. That is a system approaching its stress limits. When multiple systems begin to strain at once, the risk is not linear. It compounds. Energy disruption feeds inflation. Inflation pressures financial markets. Financial instability constrains policy options. Political decisions become more reactive. And reactive decisions increase the likelihood of further disruption. This is how feedback loops form. And once those loops are in motion, they are very difficult to slow down. Right now, there are three paths forward. The first is a temporary stabilization, a ceasefire, a negotiated pause, a reduction in immediate tension. That would relieve pressure, but it would not repair the underlying fractures. Markets might calm, but they would remain fragile. The second is a prolonged stalemate, a slow grind where no side fully escalates, but no side fully retreats. This is the most deceptive scenario. It feels stable on the surface, but it drains resources, erodes confidence, and keeps volatility elevated over time. The third is escalation, rapid, uncontrolled, and systemically disruptive. If the Strait of Hormuz remains constrained, if military actions intensify, if political rhetoric turns into irreversible decisions, the shock will not stay regional. It will transmit globally, through energy prices, through capital markets, through economic growth. And that is when a geopolitical crisis becomes a global economic event. The most important thing to understand is this: systems do not fail because of one event. They fail because multiple pressures converge at the same time. That convergence is happening now. The United States, under Donald Trump, is applying pressure. Iran is applying counterpressure. Markets are reacting. Institutions are adjusting. And the margin for error is shrinking with every passing hour. This is no longer just about strategy. It is about stability. Because once a system reaches this level of stress, outcomes are no longer fully controlled by any single actor. They are determined by how the entire system responds under pressure. And history is very clear about one thing. When pressure builds to this point, something eventually gives. What we have just witnessed is not simply a geopolitical episode, it is a revealing moment about how power actually operates in the modern world. At the center of this story is Donald Trump, a leader who chose to compress time, raise pressure, and force outcomes through a public ultimatum. Around him, a system responded, not in isolation, but as an interconnected web. Iran leveraged geography through the Strait of Hormuz. The United States demonstrated military reach and technological discipline. Markets reacted instantly, pricing fear and uncertainty before facts could even settle. Legal boundaries were tested. And beneath it all, a deeper reality emerged: no single actor fully controls the outcome once systemic pressure begins to build. This is the core lesson. Power today is no longer just about strength, it is about managing complexity under pressure. Every decision creates second-order effects. Every signal reshapes behavior across multiple systems at once. And once those systems begin interacting, the margin for control shrinks rapidly. For all of us watching, there is something deeper to take away beyond politics. In our own lives, we often think control comes from force, from pushing harder, deciding faster, demanding outcomes. But real control comes from understanding the system you are operating in. It comes from timing, from discipline, from knowing when to act, and just as importantly, when not to escalate. Because once pressure builds too far, even the strongest position can become unstable. So here's a question for you. In moments of high pressure, what creates better outcomes? A. Acting fast and forcing a decision. B. Slowing down and understanding the system before acting. Comment A or B below, I want to see how you think. And more importantly, what's your take on this situation? Do you believe this crisis is moving toward resolution, or toward escalation? Share your perspective in the comments so others can learn from it too. If you found this breakdown valuable, subscribe to the channel. That's how we keep going, bringing you clear, sharp analysis of the forces shaping your world.